which is like really kind of open-ended, and I think like she thought that would be fun. We thought that would be fun for her to talk about, because it's kind of in a stage of you don't really know what the right question is, you don't really know what the research design is. Here is how I got interested in this, and so I think it's like a research program in motion, and that's fun to talk about, I think, and it's fun to hear your feedback on it. And today what we thought we'd do was just kind of go back to this, I call this canonical research design redux, which is, let's go through some more papers that use these very sort of canonical research designs and think about the questions, and then how you address the questions. So when I say canonical research design, I mean these tools for looking at causality. We're going to look again at study. The first study is going to involve, so we already saw this last week. The first example is going to be of a randomized control trial. James Habyarimana et al. In the paper in Kampala that Professor Bautista talked about yesterday, they randomly sampled people. They randomly approached people to get them to come to the experiment. So that was an explicit randomization, but you haven't seen any. We haven't really talked about an example of a so-called field experiment in the way that the first paper is about. Okay, so this would be, Alex would say, this is an expensive project. And then this is by John Weigel, who's a PhD student of mine who I've worked a lot with. He's the co-author on that paper at the Kruger Kingdom. So we wrote that when he was a PhD student at Harvard. And then I'm going to Kananga on Sunday. We're going to start a new round of field experiments in Kananga, also expensive. And I could talk a little bit about what we're planning to do. That's still up in the air a little bit. The second paper, which is by continuity design, and then I'm going to talk about this paper by Goldstein, and Professor Bautista will talk about the paper by Goldstein and Udry, which uses an instrumental variable strategy in the same way that Nunn and Watchito uses instrumental variable strategy. So Loza Montero used this regression discontinuity design. You're going to see another example of that again today. So the idea today is just, I think these are all interesting questions, and they use these sort of canonical research designs. And, that's like the way I think about doing research is, you look for a question, and then you figure out what a hypothesis is, and then you figure out how to articulate the question and the hypothesis within one of these canonical research designs, basically. And there's not that many of them. There's only about 4 or 5, in fact. So, and they're all easy to implement in Stata. But this one is a very cheap project. So after the project, I'm going to tell you about the project we did with the regression discontinuity. That's all secondary data, and I'll tell you how we did that. Okay. So, and again, the papers I'm going to talk about today differ in terms of, are they about a big social science question, or are they looking specifically at some aspect of African society? So the first 2 papers by Weigel and by me and my collaborators are really using Africa and African materials to talk about kind of big issues in social science, kind of independent of Africa, using natural experiments, or real experiments in the first case, natural experiments in my case, to look at big social science questions. And then the third paper I go through usually is really about Africa, trying to understand how African systems of property rights in land influence productivity and investment incentives. So that's a very Africa-specific type study. And as I said, Marcus Goldstein works at the World Bank. Chris Udry has done a lot of very pioneering work in Nigeria, mostly in Nigeria and Ghana. But he also has a fantastic paper on Burkina Faso about conflict within the family and agricultural productivity. Okay. So let me start by telling you about Weigel's randomized property tax collection in Kananga in the RDC, in the DRC. So what's this about? Well, he's interested in the big social science question. So in political science in particular, when you ask, where does democracy come from? So how did all these Western European societies develop these democratic and accountable political systems? One of the arguments is it's actually to do with taxation. So in the early modern period, states emerged, fiscal states, tax systems emerged in Western Europe, in France, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Portugal, in England. In fact, England never really had a proper tax system until 1690, after this famous glorious revolution. Before that, taxes were farmed out. So I needed to collect customs. I'm the government. How do I collect customs? I have no bureaucracy to do that. There's no kind of administration. I sell the right to you. You give me some money, you go collect the customs. I don't care how you do it. I give you the right to go and collect the customs in exchange for a lump sum of money. That's how the government raised taxes. They farmed the customs, they farmed the excise taxes. Occasionally they would levy poll taxes, where the sheriff of every county, so all the counties of England had a sheriff who was an official appointed by the king, and the sheriff of each county was told to go and collect, so much money, and each adult was supposed to pay a fixed amount of money in a poll tax. So again, there was no administration to do that. There were officials like the sheriff, and there were other officials, but even down to village constables who were not paid. So there were government officials. There were no explicit there was no tax office, there were no tax institutions. There were officials who were mostly involved in dispute resolution and legal matters, as we'll see, the justice of the peace, and they were told to collect the poll tax as best they could. So when these fiscal states started to be constructed, then okay, if we're going to start paying taxes in this way, we want control over how the money gets allocated. We want representation. We want accountability. So one of the big stories in political science is that, it's actually this business of taxation which leads to a homogeneous process whereby society reacts and demands representation and demands accountability. I'm being taxed, I want to control how the money is spent. So that's a big idea in political science, but it's never been tested empirically. And you can see why it's difficult to test it empirically. Like, how could I test the causality running from taxation to representation? I could look across the world and I could see whether there's a correlation between, the size of the fiscal system or tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, and and how democratic the countries they are. But that would be extremely difficult to tease out the causation by just looking at something like that. Of course, if you looked at it over time, you'd have more chance of looking at causality. But his idea was, let's do an experiment in Kananga to look at this. And the reason he was able to do this is that when we were working on the Kuba Kingdom and related projects, he got very friendly with these local politicians, and particularly the governor and the mayor of Kananga. And so he persuaded the governor to allow him basically to introduce this. The governor was thinking about kind of trying to increase taxation, particularly property taxation, and he persuaded him to randomize it. Okay, so in Kananga, let me show you. Here's Kananga. Here's Google Earth. Kananga from Google Earth, and you can see. I don't know if you can see these red neighborhoods. Treated neighborhoods are shaded red. So here's the whole city of Kananga, and within Kananga, there's 431 neighborhoods with about 27,000 properties, and he persuaded the governor to basically randomly roll out this tax. I'll tell you more about what this tax program. So, of course, it's not fair to tax one neighborhood and not another neighborhood, right? So everyone is going to get taxed eventually,
but what he managed to do is persuade the government to randomly choose, the governor to randomly choose half the neighborhoods to receive, you know, the tax treatment first, and then there's enough of a lag that he could collect data, and then it gets rolled out everywhere. Okay, so of course property tax existed prior to this experience in 2015, 2016, but basically nobody paid. So there was no administration for this. You were supposed to pay property tax on your property, depending on, you know, the size of the property and the construction or whatever. But nobody really paid except some businesses downtown. Most people never paid because the way you were meant to pay is you were meant to voluntarily go, you know, to the government office and, you know, and pay your property tax. But basically nobody did it, and there were no sanctions. Okay, so what this property tax campaign was the governor agreed to hire these tax collectors who would go round to every house in the, so that you randomly select half the neighborhoods. The property tax collectors go around house by house. They create a kind of spreadsheet of all the properties. So they give you a tax number, they write it. If you go around Kananga now, it's like written on the houses with chalk or something on the door, whatever. And they ask for $2. You know, it's a modest amount of property tax on, that's like a normal house, okay? And again, eventually everyone got the campaign. So before this, you know, property tax income was basically zero, right? And about 10% of the people treated paid, okay? So I'm going to look at some data. It's kind of interesting, like who paid. So you know, think about half the people in Kananga get treated, and after they're treated, what does that mean exactly? Well, I can tell you. I'll tell you in detail in a second. Okay. This is what it means to be treated. So the property tax collector sort of gave a message saying, you know, they show up, these three guys. This compound has mostly guys, some women. This compound has a legal obligation to pay the property tax for 2016. The provincial government will use the money to promote economic development of the province. I guess you may be skeptical about that in Congo. If you do not pay today, please indicate a date and time when you will pay, and I will return. Okay, so you come, the property tax collectors come, they register your house, they ask for this tax. And people say, no, I don't have any money, I can't pay. Okay, fine. When can you pay? Can we come back? Well, come back in 2 weeks' time, whatever. Okay, so the people come away, they come back in 2 weeks' time. We come to collect the property tax, we don't have any money, we can't pay the tax. Okay, so what should happen? In principle, there's sanctions and whatever. In practice, nobody gets punished. So nobody got punished before this, and there's no mechanism really for punishing these people afterwards. So you could sort of say it's kind of surprising that even 10% of people pay. What's interesting in the data, as you'll see, is that people think they could get punished, but somehow, you know, it doesn't really influence their behavior. Okay, so such sanctions are rare, I think, you know, effectively non-existent for residential property. Maybe if you're owning a big store in the city center or whatever, then it's more serious. Okay. All right, so here's Kananga. Okay, I think I went through that. Okay, and if you pay your tax, here's what you get. You get a little receipt. Here's some examples. Look at that. How about this for bureaucracy? Province of Kasai Central, you know, the city of Kananga, here's whatever it is, and, you know, here's whatever you paid in Congolese francs. This is about $2. Like, there's about 1,000 Congolese francs to $1. So that's what you got. They had these machines which the governor bought, and then he handed a property tax receipt. Okay, so the paper's very nice, you know, and I think, like, I don't know if I should go into this in detail, but like when you set these studies up, you have to kind of think about, so you have this randomized controlled trial, and, you know, what's the question he's interested in? So if you go back to my initial motivation, the question he's interested in is, I come along and I try to tax you, okay? So only 10% of people actually paid. Of course, there's a control group. What happens in the control group? Well, the control group, nothing's happening. It's just like the old system. So basically, nobody's paying, okay? So in the treatment group, 10% of people are paying. So that's interesting. But in some sense, you know, the way to this design is like a kind of intention to treat, meaning I'm going to ignore, you know, whether people pay or not is kind of endogenous. So what I'm interested in is the impact of the campaign on people's political behavior. So remember, the motivation is taxation generates this demand for representation. So irrespective of whether or not you actually pay, the 10% of people pay, 90% of people don't pay, irrespective of that, what does this campaign do to your political activities? That's the idea, okay? But one of the things which is complicated about these studies is you have to think through all the kind of things that could be confounding it. You know, like, what's the mechanism here exactly? I'm still not sure I know the answers to that, actually. But like, so imagine some tax collectors show up with a little machine to give you a receipt, and they register your house, and what does that tell you? Like, even if you don't pay, does that tell you something about, oh, the government's much more organized than I thought it was, you know? Like, this is amazing. I've never seen this before in Kananga. Something's going on here. Like, what do you infer from the government tax collector showing up? And you know, and so one thing that the paper's very careful about is sort of trying to think through different stories about, you know, and particularly stories that could mess up the research design. So, for example, remember there's these treatment neighborhoods and there's these control neighborhoods. But one thing you might be worried about is kind of information spilling over into the control neighborhoods. Like, you know, maybe you know, maybe the knowledge gets around. You know, people get around. People have relatives, or they have, you know, they know people. They, you know, so word is going to spread. Okay. So one thing they did, which is sort of interesting, is even in the, you know, even in the control groups, they sent out a flyer in French and Chiluba, which is the main local language there, basically kind of announcing this provincial tax collectors are beginning door-to-door property tax collection throughout the city. You know, the money collected would be used to secure the province to kickstart economic development. So the idea here is that everybody in the city knows what's going on, so you're trying to estimate the effect of these tax collectors sort of actually showing up at your house, okay, not just the knowledge. So you want to kind of level the knowledge, and you know, and so this is just one example, but the paper is very good at sort of thinking through these examples. Okay, so of course I randomly selected some neighborhoods to tax and other neighbors not to tax, but you're always interested in balance, right? So you're always interested in whether the treatment and control group look the same. Okay, so even if you randomize, you still need to check that there's balance. So I'm not going to go, there's a huge amount of different balance characteristics. The page goes on for tables, so this is just, I couldn't fit it all in a slide. I'm just kind of giving you a hint of, you know, the hint of, you know, what's there, you know, household size, house quality index, etc., etc. Lots of things, including, you know, trust in researchers and all sorts of things. So just, you know, and this is just, you know, trying to show that, yeah, sometimes, you know, there's some statistical differences, but, you know, that's not surprising by chance, you know, especially when you have so many variables. But the general picture is there's not statistically significant differences between the treatment and control, and, you know, that's kind of what you'd expect. But sometimes, you know, even when you randomize things, like one of the things, again, they're careful is, you know, obviously the city center tends to be very different from the, you know, the kind of the banlieue, or whatever they call them, you know, and so then it's sort of stratified so that the treatment and control kind of equally sample the city center. So, you know, by chance you could end up, you know, oversampling some place which was kind of unusual. So again, the paper is very careful on stuff like that. Okay, so what's the empirical model? Well, the beauty of randomizing things is you don't need any complicated econometrics, right? So that's the beauty. You know, when I talked about the Kuba Kingdom paper, you know, you see in the paper we spend a lot of time trying to sell you on this narrative of the natural experiment, and once we got you to buy into that, then you're willing to allow me to run an ordinary least square regression, okay, and let me talk about causality. And the same thing is true here, that given the randomization and checking balance, you can use a very simple econometric model to look at the effect, and again, this is what I call the reduced form, that this is just the campaign. The main explanatory variable here is going to be this campaign, which is, a dummy, which is 1 if your neighborhood was visited by these tax collectors. They also have this, K is this randomization strata. So it's a area which is larger than the neighborhood, which is adjusting for this trying to make sure they don't oversample particular areas. So this is a dummy for 1, and then YIK is going to be some outcome of interest. I'll start looking at dependent variables in a minute. There are fixed effects, for this randomization areas, and then you have individual covariates. So there's an initial survey where they collected a lot of individual covariates, and then there's kind of more aggregate covariates, maybe at the neighborhood, the quality of the roads or stuff like that, and that this all works with ordinary least squares because of the research design. All right, okay. So one thing that's sort of interesting, I think there's a lot of puzzles. If you look at his webpage, there's a whole bunch of kind of spin-off papers to this, because there's a lot of puzzles about why what happened. So for example, if you look at compliance, so remember, basically nobody's paying taxes before this, and then these taxes better to come. So you could think about, who was paying. So suddenly 10% of these people pay. Okay, so who is it? Let's look at the characteristics of people who pay. Okay, so this is just to say, this is the program, so program here, that means campaign. So, that has a significant effect on the probability of you paying. Okay, so 10% doesn't sound like too much. Jonathan Weigel gave this talk he presented this at he's a professor at University of California, Berkeley now, but he presented this at the Harris School of Public Policy. And one of my colleagues who does public finance but works in the United States said, 10%, that's just not interesting. Why do I care about this? 10%. And I was like, this is development, this is development, man, so this is a problem the United States solved 200 years ago, and the Congo hasn't solved this problem. So, so that's where the action is. So this is just to show it's only 10%, but the program has a very large, significant effect on the probability that people will pay tax. Okay, so this is using all the data. You can see there's a lot of observations. So now look at the interaction between program and baseline wealth. Okay, so they measure wealth in different ways. It might be how big your house is or the quality of the house. I don't think they have terribly accurate information about other types of assets. But you can see that and this is just if I take the distribution of wealth and I split it between median, then there's people above median wealth, let me call that high, and there's people below median wealth. So you can see that the people who paid tended to be relatively wealthy, okay? They also tended to be relatively highly educated. So there are significant patterns. Now you might say, why does anyone pay if the probability of being punished is 0? Okay, but you see here there's a systematic pattern. Relatively wealthy people, maybe people who are more able to pay, they have more money, they're more able to pay, they have a better job, they're more likely to pay. Okay, what's also very interesting is your attitudes towards the government. You might think, if there's a country in Africa with a government which has a worse reputation than the DRC, I'm not quite sure what it is, so it has this terrible reputation, which is largely unjustified, at least if you believe this paper. So he's interested in the survey. They collected a lot of baseline information on your attitudes towards the government. Okay, so for example, do you approve of the government? Yeah, so that, again, this is like looking at the interaction with the program. So if you're in the treated part of Kananga and you tend to be, above median approval of the government, that actually significantly increases, and you can see quantitatively, it's large. That significantly increases the probability that you pay taxes. Okay, trust, nothing much happens here, but there's some sort of heterogeneity here. So this isn't really what he's interested in. I just think it's a kind of interesting question as to, who pays taxes, and and why do they pay when there's no chance that they're going to they're going to be punished. Okay, so here's more like the results that's so here so this is the main. Let me come back to that. The way I motivated this was kind of a participation or whatever. Okay, so here's let me tell you how he measured participation. Okay, fine. So now I'm going to do this taxation. My hypothesis is that if I tax you, you're going to want the state to be more accountable. You're going to participate more. So how do I do that? How do I measure that? Okay, that sounds great, but how do I measure it? So he did it in two very interesting ways. He organized these meetings, basically, where people voluntarily could go and talk to local politicians, and go and complain and ask questions. So these were town hall meetings. So he organized with local politicians to hold these town hall meetings, and then they monitor people's attendance. Okay, so they know when the people attend, are you from the treated area? Are you from the control area? Okay, so they can estimate the probability that if you're taxed, you're more likely to turn up at the town hall meeting. The second thing he did was downtown, I show you the map of Kananga. Kananga's very spread out. They put these boxes where you could basically file a complaint or make a suggestion to the governor, or like about what's going on with the state. And so they but it's costly. You had to go downtown to put this thing in this box. Okay, so this is what he called evaluation form submission. Okay, so what this shows is that if you're in the treated area, so if you're subject to this tax campaign, you're significantly more likely to show up at the town hall meeting, and you're significantly more likely to go and submit a form and put it in this box complaining about whatever. I'll show you some data in a minute. Okay, so that's very consistent with this hypothesis. It's a big hypothesis in political science that taxation kind of breeds representation. And what they did they also, they did a kind of ethnography of these town hall meetings. So, like, what did people talk about? So you could say, all right, fine, they had a town hall meeting. What did people talk about? Like football, or how Bayern Munich and Barcelona were doing. Like, how do I know what they talked about? So they collected information on that. They basically kind of took minutes of these town hall meetings and complaints about the property tax, demands, taxes, better government, complaints, taxes in general, clarification about taxes. So it's actually, they were talking about serious things, not football. I mean, football is serious, for some people. But I once had a driver in Sierra Leone who, when Chelsea were playing, he couldn't eat, for 24 hours because he'd get so nervous before the game. So he used to get Mr. Barr. He was got very excited when Chelsea played. Okay, and what did people put these they put these evaluations in this box, in the middle of Kananga, these boxes. What did they write? Okay, things about better. So they coded these things: better government, better public good provision, we need more monetary and government, better use of taxes, more citizen voice in politics, more security, peace. So it's exactly what you'd like them to talk about, like serious issues about, not frivolous or something silly. It's really about the quality of governance and accountability and public good provision. Okay, so this is really consistent with the initial hypothesis, and it's the first evidence on anything like this in social science. So they also collected, so there's a baseline survey there's an end-line survey, expensive. It's cheaper in Congo than many places, you know, because people are poor. So, but expensive. Okay. So and they were interested in. Okay. So one thing, you know, economists love like real outcomes, like the fact that people show up to this town hall meeting and it's costly, you know, or the fact they go into Kananga and they fill this form out and they put it in a box. You know, actions speak louder than words in economics, right? But the survey stuff is interesting too. So they also collected this survey information about, like, what does this do to your beliefs about the government or your opinions about the government? Okay, and this is just these are just a whole bunch of dependent variables, and these are the estimated coefficients, you know, running that ordinary least square regression model I showed you with all these different dependent variables. So this is just trying to show whether the campaign significantly impacts people's belief about the government. Okay, and it, you know, it's sort of puzzling, like integrity of tax collectors. So it significantly increased your beliefs about the integrity of tax collectors. I mean, it's kind of interesting. You know, you hire these tax collectors, you send them out into Kananga, they go round. You know, one thing they did, I haven't shown you this, is they checked, of course, whether these tax collectors, they asked people, you know, in the treatment area, so they know where these people should have come. So they asked people, did you ever see a tax collector? Did a tax collector ever come to your house? Of course, they know because they're supposed to write these things on the houses. So there's some ways of kind of checking, you know, these people actually showed up and did what they were supposed to do. And it's kind of, this aspect of it is very interesting, you know, which is that just the fact that suddenly you have these tax collectors showing up with these machines, you sort of think, gosh, you know, this is a serious thing, the government in Kananga. Okay, so you know, the performance of the tax ministry, it improves your opinions about the performance of the tax ministry, and it increases your belief. I guess this is the most interesting one. It increases your belief that the government is responsible for public good provision. You know, like Professor Bautista can talk about this tomorrow, but where we've been working in eastern Nigeria, like the typical attitude of nobody expects anything from the government in eastern Nigeria. Like you go into a village, there's basically like the only people who could be paid by the government would be school teachers, but their school teachers are not actually paid by the government because the money never comes from Abuja. So people just collect the money themselves and they pay the school teacher to keep the school going. Security is provided by like youths. They raise money for everything, basically. Like they're completely autonomous, and that's the way they like it in eastern Nigeria. And you know, of course they do pay. They don't pay taxes. There's no income tax. Of course they pay consumption taxes. You know, there's customs, and the prices of goods go up because of taxes. But that's a little hard to kind of see. And then but mostly the national government is funded by oil wealth, right? So taxes are very small relative to oil wealth. I think 90% of the government budget is oil revenues in Nigeria. But what happens here is when I start taxing your property, you know, you update you increase your belief that the government is responsible for public good. So that's very much the channel that the political scientists and that he has in mind, which is that, oh, now you're taxing me. I mean, what's interesting here, right, is that you're not necessarily taxing me in the sense that I may not pay. You know, like this is the coefficient on the campaign, but 90% of the people in the campaign don't actually pay anything. Okay, but on average, they still increase their beliefs that the government is responsible for public good provision. So of course you could sort of say, well, is there heterogeneity between people who pay and people who don't pay? That's a tricky one for economists because it's extremely endogenous whether I pay or not. And I already showed you that the people who pay are people who are wealthy, people who are more educated. So that's a tricky regression to run. But I'm just pointing out there's some kind of interesting things here in terms of people who don't actually pay. You know, they also change their beliefs about the government, about the government's responsibility for public goods, and you know, and not about other things. The ability to punish tax evaders, like they don't change that. It's not that, you know, it's a very specific intervention. You know, you could think of different interventions, but they don't change their opinion about the ability of the government to punish tax evaders, which is basically was zero and remains zero. But other thing, you know, they think the government has more information about taxpayers. That makes sense, right? You know, now these people went around the neighborhoods, they kind of, you know, they're registering people. It makes sense that the government knows more about taxpayers. And somehow it increases your perceptions of other people tax compliance. I guess you kind of think, maybe you see your next door neighbor paying, or you hear that somebody paid, or they were talking about, you know, I paid my property tax the first time. Did you see those guys in the neighborhood? So this is pretty interesting as well. I mean, this is the most interesting thing. I showed you that, and it's quite a story, isn't it? You know, I mean, in the sense that, like, it's almost too good to be true. You know, it's a sort of virtuous circle, right? You know, what do people say about Africa? Well, states are weak, you know, fiscal states are weak, state capacity is low, you know, there's problems with accountability and democracy, you know, all over Africa. What this paper says, if you take it seriously, is, well, here's a perturbation, if you like, where I managed to start raising taxes, which wasn't as difficult as you thought it was, perhaps, with a little bit of organization, and citizens respond by trying to make sure that the Congolese state actually allocates the resources to public good provision. Okay, so too good to be true, no? So it's very interesting. It's a sort of virtuous circle, right? You know, I mean, that's kind of how the story is told in Western European history, but you know, you may not believe that anyway. But that, you know, that's what it is. I think it's a very interesting study. So here, you know, just in thinking about your own research, the real trick here is getting, of course, you need money to collect the survey, but the real trick is getting the politicians to cooperate with you, to convincing the politicians, you know, that you want to raise taxes. I can help you figure out how to raise more taxes than you're raising now. Okay, so he sold the governor on, you know, like, you'd like to raise taxes. This is kind of in the bigger context of this decentralization, in some sense, this découpage that was happening. So there was this idea that, you know, we kind of need to build more autonomous resources, and, you know, but that, you know, and you could persuade a Kenyan politician or a Ugandan politician or a Tanzanian politician, you know, that this could be in their interest to raise taxes. So, but you need money for the survey, yeah. Okay, so let me say a couple of things about this. One is, you know, I wrote a paper for the AERC last year. I don't know if any of you heard me talk about it. I talked about it at one of these plenary conferences. It's on my webpage called Tax Aversion and the Social Contract in Africa. So it's coming out in this Journal of African Economies, you know, the AERC's journal. And you know, what I point out in that paper is that what's interesting about the history of political institutions in Africa, I'm talking about kind of pre-colonial political institutions, is how infrequently taxation was kind of part of the social contract. Like, if you look at what we know about most pre-colonial sort of states or, you know, social contracts, they rarely involve taxation. You know, even somewhere like Rwanda, which was like one of the most centralized pre-colonial states, had no fiscal bureaucracy, basically. The army, you know, it had an army, but the army was self-funding. You know, it had cows and it had land, and there was no fiscal system where people were taxed. Okay, and in the paper, I'm not going to talk about the paper in detail. There's a lot of stuff about African history and things like, and political economy in it. But I use this to be sort of skeptical about this obsession with taxation. So of course, public finance economists are obsessed with taxation, and you know, we have this idea of, well, the state, we need the government, you know, to provide public goods, because private people on their own, kind of non-cooperatively, can't, you know, provide an efficient level of public goods because of free riding and things like that. Okay, so but the state does many other things. And, and what's interesting, I point out, going into the colonial period, was how difficult it was for, the colonial powers to tax. So, in Sierra Leone, for example, there was what they call in Sierra Leone the Bai-Bure War in 1898. In British, colonial records, of course, it's called the Hutt Tax Rebellion. Okay, so you could say, oh yeah, that was an anti-colonial uprising. Yeah, and it was, but it was precipitated by taxation. It was also an anti-taxation uprising. If you look at the Aba Women's War in Nigeria in 1929, which is actually something Professor Bautista will talk about tomorrow that we've been studying, this was a kind of remarkable, this was an uprising by women against the colonial state. Why? Again, because of taxation. So when the British consolidated administration in the south of Nigeria, they didn't tax anybody. They introduced these native courts, and they promoted these people called warrant chiefs to be head of the native court. But there was no taxation. They just administered justice and solved disputes. And it was when they decided they should start raising taxes that there was this massive rebellion, particularly led by women. And Professor Bautista is going to talk about powerful women in eastern Nigeria tomorrow. I'm going to talk about powerful women in Ghana by the end of today. Okay, so I want to say, I could give other examples. Yeah, they're anti-colonial uprisings, obviously, but they're also anti-tax uprisings. Okay, that's kind of what I emphasize in this paper. All right, so what I talk about in the paper is that I think there's actually deep reasons in African history for why there's this antipathy towards taxation. Okay, and so Professor Weigel and I, we've been talking about this a lot, and that's what we're going to do in Kananga, which is now just starting next week, if we can get, Congo is like the size of Western Europe, except there's no roads and no air traffic. So there's like one flight a week to Kananga. So if I manage to get there, sometimes you have to go in cargo. It's exciting. So what are we going to do next? Well, think about this issue of dispute resolution. In a much deeper way. One of my favorite books when I was an undergraduate was John Locke's Second Treatise in Government. So written in one of these famous books in political philosophy, written in the 17th century. And Locke was one of the kind of, the intellectual masterminds behind this transition that took place with the Glorious Revolution. I mentioned the creation of this modern fiscal system after 1688 in the 1690s. So Locke's book is sort of famous in political philosophy for providing a kind of contractarian version of the state, So Locke was arguing against these models of like autocracy and the divine right of kings and all this other stuff. His view was that, sovereignty rests with the people, and the government is a kind of emerges as a contract between people. People voluntarily decide to create these institutions, okay? And he talks about why it was valuable to why is it valuable to have these institutions? Why is it valuable to have a state and state administration and state institutions? And he doesn't talk about taxation, okay? Here's what he says. He says, I easily grant that civil government, the state basically, is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature. So the state of nature was this sort of thought experiment of a world without a state, okay, before there was a government, okay? Inconveniences. So having a state is a solution to inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great where men may be judges in their own case. So it's all about dispute resolution. So he sort of says, why do we need a government? He never mentions public goods. He says, well, if there's no government and Alex and I get into a dispute, we both have a vested interest in the outcome. He thinks he's right and I think I'm right. So you need a third party to come in and evaluate the evidence and try to make, to resolve this dispute in a kind of objective way. So for Locke, dispute resolution was actually at the heart of sort of state formation, not taxation. If you read, my favorite book on African history, which is Jan van Sina. Jan van Sina was the great historian of Central Africa, who taught, he passed away recently, but he taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. his past in the rainforest is his sort of long-run history of the Congo Basin, you could say. And he talks about exactly the same thing, about the emergence of bigger political organization sort of states and how did they happen. And he points out that etymology of headman, the word for headman, is to decide, to judge, to arbitrate. You know, that the origin of political institutions is actually much more connected to dispute resolution than it is to taxation. Okay, so so what we're doing in Kananga now is, you know, is basically we're working with these chiefs to try to look at how improving dispute resolution or varying the way dispute resolution happens can influence people's attitudes towards the state. So to the extent that you want to have taxation, I guess we all think taxation is a good idea, assuming you can get the government to allocate it on socially desirable things. Is dispute resolution a kind of path towards, like, my view is that dispute resolution is actually much more fundamental than taxation. So we're trying to figure out how to show that in Kananga. So you see I'm confused because I still don't exactly know what the research design is. And you know, but that's the kind of the fun bit, I think. So that's what I'm doing starting next Tuesday in Kananga with John, and that's an expensive project. Yeah. So okay, good. So that's where we are. So I think, you know, I think the paper I've been talking about by John Weigel is like, it's a fantastic paper. Maybe it's too good to be true. But there you go. That's the data. I think there's nothing. I don't think there's anything funny. I guess you could say, even if it is true, I think what I find interesting about this is like, if you're going to do something like this in one part of Africa where you would be certain it wouldn't work, it would be Congo, right? I mean, like, so there's other places where, you know, my personal experience, people have much higher regard for the government. They have much more trust and faith in the government, and you know, but in Congo that's very unusual. So I find that interesting. Of course, there's a huge issue of like, you know, there's a huge issue of external validity. So, you know, so I haven't talked too much about this, but, you know, most of these research designs are very focused on internal validity, you know, by which I mean, you know, identifying some causal relationship in some particular context. But let's imagine he did that. Let's imagine that everything is fine, and, you know, he really estimated the causal effect of this tax campaign on people's willingness to pay or people's willingness to participate politically. You could still say there's no external validity to that, meaning the context is so specific. You know, if I did the same campaign in Dar es Salaam, you know, or Narok or whatever, I'd find completely different results because the people are different, because their attitudes towards the government are different, because their attitudes towards taxation and representation are different, and, you know, so that's much more the issue of kind of external validity. But I guess my general view is that, you know, external validity is so difficult to, like, the world is so diverse and so culturally and institutionally different. I'm not sure I believe very much in external validity, but I don't care very much either. You know, I think it's intrinsically interesting, and, you know, and you just have to think about how to adapt a particular intervention to a different context, okay? And I think, you know, there's a big debate in academia in America about these randomized controlled trials, and some people think it's the only thing you should do, and some people think you should never do it. And my view is that, you know, it's a great idea if you can use it to ask an interesting question. So I think this paper is outstanding in that it used an RCT to ask an interesting question, and a question which social scientists have been talking about, you know, for decades or maybe hundreds of years. Probably if you go back, Max Weber, you know, talked about this over 100 years ago. So he used an RCT to ask an interesting question, and if you can do that, you know, that's a great idea. Okay, so now that was a randomized controlled trial. Let me see what the time is. Okay, great. So I'm gonna I'll talk about this other paper, and then we can have tea, and then I'll talk about the final paper that Professor Bautista was going to talk about. All right. So that was a randomized controlled trial. Let me talk about something completely different, which was inspired by a very famous old conjecture in anthropology. So this is work where Jacob Moscone and I talked about Jacob's paper yesterday about age and kin societies. Yes, so yes, please, yes. I warned you, Professor Baptiste is much better at getting people to ask questions.
Yeah, I was so much interested in how you undertook the study because we tried one, but it failed because of contamination and interference with the sample. Yeah, we were doing a study to targeting tax areas to see if some interventions that we can put in place to enhance repayment of payment of tax.
Yeah.
While at the same time paying tax obligation. What we realized was that taxpayers who had tax arrears were finding it difficult to pay the tax arrears at the same time meeting their usual obligations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like they are having two payments running at the same time. So they will either default on the payment of the tax arrears or accumulate more tax arrears by defaulting on them. So we tried, using RCT, we tried, as a study we were doing, to see if we can extend the payment period for the tax arrears.
Okay.
To see if they'll be able now to comply.
I see. So you randomly allowed some people to have more time to pay.
Yeah, because we usually have 6 months. We give
Okay.
a repayment period of 6 months. So we decided to give them longer, of running up to 12 months. Because by that it also means that even the amount they'll be paying will be reduced, and so they'll be able to pay the usual obligations, also pay the tax arrears. Then we are also giving waivers on the fines.
Okay.
Yes, but the program went on for some time. We did it from 2016, but we could not proceed. We had to stop it last year because of contamination.
But what does contamination mean?
Contamination in terms of we offer her the 12 months, then she also passes that information to others who are not offered, then they come for that. Yet it was just a study. It was not meant for everyone.
I see.
Yeah, so you find that whatever you are testing now cannot work because there are people now who are coming to request for those interventions. Yes, they were not part of the study. Then again, there was also pressure to collect tax arrears, and the officers who are handling those taxpayers,
Yeah.
we had talked to them to safeguard the sample that we are working with.
Yeah.
But you'll find that they will even go into the sample that we are working with to also tell them to pay just like the other taxpayers.
Yeah.
Yeah, without caring that these taxpayers were under study. So there was interference with the sample, and then there was that contamination, and so our study could not progress.
Yeah.
We were doing it with Professor Lorenzo from University of Zurich.
Okay.
And
I know.
and
Yeah,
Dina Pomeranz.
Casaburi.
Yes,
I know
Casaburi.
him. He was a student at Harvard when I used to teach at Harvard.
Dina Pomeranz, also from the University of Zurich.
Yes.
So we faced a lot of challenges. So I'm just wondering how this one was able to be successfully executed, because I'm imagining if the taxman comes to my house,
Yeah.
then in the evening I meet somebody else, I'll tell him, the taxman came to my place and these were the issues. You know, by that information is going to pass around and it's going to change the behavior of everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know how they were able to handle that kind of.
Well, I mean, yeah, this information channel, you know, I emphasize that in the slide, that they tried to spread the information everywhere so that they could really say it was it's not just the knowledge or the information that this campaign is taking place, but it's the fact that these 3 people show up at my house and register me and ask me for the tax, that everyone kind of knows in the whole city this is happening, and then you can look at the impact of it actually happening. I mean, that being said, as I mentioned, it's still a little mysterious, like what the mechanism is. Like when you know, you see from that table, nobody's updating their beliefs about the ability of the state to punish tax evasion, but you're still paying. So if you read the paper, his interpretation is that somehow this is bolstering the legitimacy of the state. You know, like one of the reasons people pay taxes is because they think this is not, you know, this is hard to model in economic theory. There's no theory of like legitimacy in economics or political science for that matter. But I think in reality, you know, people do have ideas about whether the state is legitimate, and you know, and so this somehow his view is that this bolsters. That was kind of the way I tried to tell you the story. It sort of bolsters the legitimacy of the state. But I mean, those are great questions. I don't know, like, why this, you know, maybe this is such an unusual thing. People were so surprised, you know, they'd never seen a tax collector before in their life in Congo. And, you know, but they're more sophisticated in Kenya, you know.
Because actually undertaking such a study on tax is very difficult because of the pressure to collect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you are going to say that this set of taxpayers are going to be controlled, then we are not going to demand taxes from them for such a period of time, and yet you have a target to collect the taxes, it becomes very difficult to
So one thing they're doing actually is that Weigel, with another student of mine, Augustin Bergeron, they're doing more experiments with taxation and actually also trying to like look at titles. So you can just you can imagine in Kananga, so most people don't have proper title to their houses. They don't have a government title. They just kind of de facto living there. They built the house or whatever. So they're trying to look at the effect of this titling program also. But one thing I can ask about actually is what you know, we'll meet with these tax people, like what do they think you know, is this what's happening now, you know, because now they're trying to since they did this experiment, they're trying to collect this taxation, property taxation every year. So what I should do, I'll send you an email, I can send you all an email, is we can ask people what's happening now. You know, it could be that people pay and then they realize, yeah, nothing's going to happen, and then they just stop paying, basically. Yeah.
I think another interesting thing I've seen is the staggered rollout. It could be the one that is helping maybe to really differentiate between the treatment and the control. So maybe if in his case, they would have told the taxpayers that maybe it is a staggered rollout. Like we want to see if increasing maybe the payment period will increase your ability to pay. So maybe next time it will be you being on the program. Maybe it could have worked. Because now it becomes like it's unfair. Why is this one more favored than me? But if it is presented in a way that it is a staggered rollout, like you will eventually benefit, maybe then it will be easier to reduce the contamination, because the person will say, maybe next year I'll be the one now on the program. I don't know, maybe.
This is a sattva violation, you know, like if we're going to, sorry, I won't go into econometrics, you know what I mean by that? It's like, yeah, so, yeah, I think, I mean, I'll find out, I can find out. Yeah, I don't have an answer to like why they didn't have the same types of problems that maybe you found in Kenya, and it's I don't know. Like it could just be it's a kind of tax-free zone, Congo. Like, but it, yeah, I just don't know. We could ask him what he thinks about this, but I can try to find out. Yeah, I think, you know. So yeah.
I'm getting interested in what Alex is asking, and I'm just wondering what was the target population. Was it so big to impact on the tax?
Actually, we were still at the pilot stage. Eh? You see, for this kind of study, because of the cost, you cannot just roll it out nationwide. Eh? So what we did, we were doing pilots using the tax stations that are based in Nairobi. There are 4 of them. Yeah, so we started with 1, then we went to 2, then we went to the 4 of them. So all this period, we were trying to test those interventions while we also look at how they are making the taxpayers that were put in the sample are making their payments. Yeah, so even by the time so now, because Nairobi has a high concentration of taxpayers, and we were just working with like 50 taxpayers per station. Eh?
Okay.
It came to a point that it was the other taxpayers will also heard of it, and they also wanted to be included in the program, and it was becoming difficult now to.
But you're giving away a favor, you know. You're giving away a kind of break, like you're not giving away a favor here, you know, in the sense that like I see you being taxed. No, I don't want to be.
The way we drafted the letters, it was to show them that it was a short, a time-bound program, a short program, and it was not meant for everyone.
Okay.
Of course, if you get a letter and you are my neighbor, you will just discuss, and then you will also be interested.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess that maybe one of the answers is the intervention here is very different. You know, and they're not giving favors away. Like you were giving people a holiday or something in order to kind of defer whatever. And yeah, exactly. But that's not. That's this is different here. But the thrust this conversation is the Kenyan government are interested in creative ideas. And they're willing to do randomizations and. So that's exciting, but I guess like for me, what I like about relative to that study, that's also Dina Pomerantz involved in that. Yes, I also taught her. So they're two of my former students. They're both they're excellent scholars. But like for me, we could talk more about it. I haven't seen the connection to a big social science question. I like big social science questions. You kind of got the idea already. So that paper I like because it's about a big social science question, written by historians and sociologists. And so I'm not interested terribly in helping the Kenyan government collect more money from its citizens. I'm interested in social science, So do you see the distinction? I mean, I understand, but that's what I do, So, okay, so talking of social science, let me talk about this paper. And again, I think like this lecture is just the usual thing of like trying to mix, getting you to think about these research designs with interesting questions, or at least what I think are interesting questions. There's lots of different sorts of questions. I don't really mind what sorts of questions you ask, but ask them. Yeah. So this is with my student and Nathan Nunn, we used to co-teach together at Harvard, and he did that fantastic work about the long-run impact of the slave trade that we talked about. Professor Bautista talked about last week, and this is I won't get too much into this, but this is more kind of sociology about African society. You could tell from yesterday's discussion that I'm very interested in African society and the way that African society kind of differs from Western society, and not because I'm interested in the Africa dummy either. Quite the contrary, as you'll see. If you've read Africa's Latent Assets, you know that actually I think the African society, and actually that was the kind of reaction that you all had to Jackie Ella's paper, that actually African society, the organization of African society, is an advantage, not a disadvantage. And you can only construe it to be a disadvantage by kind of focusing on it in a partial way. That was my conclusion from yesterday's discussion. So what were we interested in this? Okay, I'm gonna jump all of that. Okay, and I'm going to show you this. We were interested in a very famous paper written in the 1960s by Marshall Salins, who was one of the most famous social anthropologists. And Marshall Salins formulated a hypothesis about what he called a segmentary lineage society. So we were talking about lineage societies yesterday. And many of these nilotic societies that kind of came up in the discussion would be classified as so-called segmentary lineage society. So the classic segmentary lineage society in the anthropology literature is this so-called Nuer of South Sudan. So the Nuer, they were studied by Edward Evans Pritchard, this British social anthropologist, who kind of developed this idea of a segmentary lineage society. The Somalis would also be an example. So here's what a segmentary lineage society looks like. How do we think about, so there's different, yesterday Jacob Moscona was talking, I was talking about these societies organized by age and societies organized by kinship. So you could say that a segmentary lineage society is a particular type of kinship society. And it features three aspects, okay? So I'm going to focus this because we had to code this from ethnographic sources. I'll give you a flavor of that in a second. And it features what's called unilineal descent. Okay, so that could be either matrilineal or patrilineal, and usually from a kind of mythic ancestor like Somal. You know, so all Somalis have this kind of ideology. They have these lineages. The lineages are grouped together in clans. There are these clan families, and they all trace their ancestry back to this Somal, probably a mythical ancestor. Okay, and in some sense, Somali society. Here's a map from an ethnographer of Somali. You know, Samal. Here's Samal, and you know these are some of the large, you know, kind of clan families: Darood, Hawiye, Isak, and you know there are these sort of sub-clans. But this is a kind of reconstruction of what Somali society looks like. You know, it's made up of these clans and sub-clans, and then down to these lineages. And they all, you know, if you trace your ancestry back far enough, we're all related to this Samal. Okay? So, I don't know, does Luo society have something like this? Is there some mythical founding ancestor of also, yeah. Yeah. So the Somalis are famous for being able to recite their ancestry. I was once on a bus in Paris with these Somalis. They turned out to be Somalis. And they were sort of greeting each other, but they had this incredibly elaborate greeting that went on for ages and ages as they kind of recited their clan genealogy. And I guess if you go back far enough, you'll discover that, you know, we're all related to each other. So this is, you know, this is a sort of, you know, very observed, you know, kind of intensely empirically observed example of what I'm calling a segmentary lineage society. So there's an example of, you know, unilineal lineage. Lineages feature segments, you know, in the sense of, you know, there's segments into clans and sub-clans and down into lineages, and you know and these lineages take on, you know, corporate form in the sense that, you know, these lineage societies, you know, who administers justice or dispute resolution, kind of organizes collective activities. That would be, you know, the kind of what they call the minimal segment in anthropology, okay? And so the typical classification is, you know, it's a society with unilineal descent. The segments take on, these are sort of, you know, think of this as clan or sub-clan or lineages. They take on corporate form, meaning it's the segments that undertake dispute resolution, collective activity, etc., and segments reside together. So they tend to reside in territorial units. So for example, in Buganda, if I understand correctly, you have these clans, but the clans don't live in the same place. Clans are sort of scattered everywhere. The kind of clan people from what particular clan. I remember going into the Buganda parliament, and they had, you know, the pangolin or the hippopotamus clan. You have these totems, and then someone describing to me how, you know, these clans don't all reside together. Okay, they're scattered. All right, so I won't go, you know, there's a lot of discussion of the ethnographic literature in the paper, which I won't talk about. I'll just try to sort of jump, where's Salins? Let me jump, I haven't got to, I don't know where Salins' hypothesis is yet. Maybe I messed up. Here we go. Here's Salins' hypothesis. So this was the start of this paper, which, you know, I don't know if this counts as a puzzle, but in the way I've been defining a puzzle. But Marshall wrote a paper in 1961, and he said, the segmentary lineage organization, you know, here's a description from Evans Pritchard's famous book about the Nuer. The segmentary lineage organization is a successful predatory organization in conflicts with other tribes. Even if it's been initiated by a small lineage segment, it pits all of us against them. So his argument was that what's distinct about a lineage society is that it's extremely good at organizing conflict, because there's a kind of ideology of interconnection between vast numbers of people which you can use to mobilize people to fight. Okay, so he particularly uses a history of conflict between the Nuer and the Dinka in the Sudan, in the South Sudan, in his paper, which I guess is kind of interesting given what's going on in South Sudan at the moment, where you have, you know, at least from the ignorant outside perspective, there does seem to be a line of cleavage, between President Salva Kiir, who's a Dinka, and Riek Machar, who's a Nuer. And I don't know to what extent that actually explains the conflict in reality, but at least at some superficial level, there's some relationship between these historical organizations and the particular conflict or civil war you see today. So our idea was, well, there's a lot of social science interested in the determinants of conflict and the instance of conflict. Could this hypothesis be right? Could there actually be a relationship between conflict and a particular type of social organization in Africa? Okay, so that's what we were interested in. Do societies that were traditionally organized into segmentary lineages experience more conflict today? Okay, and I think I'm particularly interested in talking about this, because of the research design and because of the data we use, and let me tell you about the data, okay? So the first thing we had to do is we had to decide. So I've mentioned a few times this database called the Ethnographic Atlas. But the Ethnographic Atlas, is a sort of data set of 800 different societies within Africa, and it has about 100 variables sort of classifying, like trying to measure different aspects of these societies, their technology, their involvement in different sorts of economic activities, agriculture or fishing, their political institutions, their social institutions, their types of kinship systems or whatever, but nowhere does it actually classify societies in this way that, many anthropologists have done as segmentary lineage. So the first thing we wanted to do is, obviously some of these societies like the Nuer and Somalis are extremely famous, the Tiv in Nigeria, so there are some very famous segmentary lineage societies, but that, that doesn't get you very far if you want to run regressions. So we had to systematically try to come up with a coding scheme, and we started with not the Ethnographic Atlas, but the Ethnographic Survey of Africa. Okay, so that's this fantastic resource, which was a big project run by Darrell Ford, who was a British social anthropologist at Oxford, starting in the 1940s. It went on for 30 years, with many anthropologists trying to write, kind of in a comparable way, these systematic ethnographies of different parts of Africa. So we started with that, and then we just basically went to the library. So they should have this in the library. I don't know what's the library like at the University of Kenya here or in Nairobi, but I hope they have this. It's online in the University of Chicago library, so it's digital. I don't know if you get access to this in Kenya, but in principle, these ethnographic resources are, you don't have to collect any information, it's in the library. What we did was, we went to the ethnographic library at Harvard, and we just took out all the volumes, Jacob and I, and we just started going through them, and we tried to convince ourselves, that we could code these things, okay? And what's a coding scheme? This comes from a book by Middleton and Tate. So John Middleton was a great British social anthropologist. He actually wrote the volume of the Ethnographic Survey of Africa about the Kikuyu, actually, Middleton did. So Middleton worked a lot in this part of Africa. And they proposed, this is a book called Tribes Without Rulers. So they're talking particularly about, so-called stateless societies, of which the Kikuyu would have counted as one in the pre-colonial period. And this is what they sort of say. Well, the segmentary lineage society has unilineal descent, as I mentioned. Segments take corporate form, as I mentioned, and they lineages and genealogical relationship affects one's location of residence. Okay, so that's the three criteria. I already mentioned that. So what did we do? So here's an example. Okay, so here's an example from Nigeria. Just so this is what we did. Here's an example. This is just a photograph from the volume of one of the volumes of the Ethnographic Survey of Africa. This is not one of the more detailed ones, actually. Some of these things, of course, are incredibly detailed because, we know a lot about some sorts of societies in Africa. We know a lot about Buganda or the Luo or whatever. We know much less about the Idoma, for example. But here's a description of the lineage, okay? And so, if you read this thing, you see, related in the male line, made up of a sublineage, theoretically of more recent origin, if you just read through this, what we're looking for is, is the Idoma a segmentary lineage society, meaning, does it satisfy these three criteria of unilineal descent? The segments take on this corporate form, and they kind of reside together. And if you read through this, you'll see that the answer is yes. Okay. And then what we did is we just go to the library. You go to the library and you just work your way through the shelves. And then you find a book by B.J. Dudley, Parties and Politics in Northern Nigeria. And on page 60-61, he refers to the Idoma as a segmentary lineage society. So just trying to kind of cross-check or validate our coding by looking at whether it's consistent with how other scholars have kind of talked about particular societies. So this is very time-consuming. But actually, I find this terribly fun doing this kind of thing. Like most of those things that we talked about, I discovered purely by chance by just, taking a book off the library shelf or whatever. So, okay, and here's what we ended up. So you can see there's a lot of blank spaces. That just means there's not enough information to code. Either there's no ethnographic information about these societies, or there's not enough information to code it one way or the other. The darker, so all the ones that are shaded we were able to code one way or other, either segmentary lineage or non-segmentary lineage. I don't quite understand why Somalia should be, shaded bigger than that. If you see it, I don't know why that's a kind of typo. Okay, and then you see, some of these places like the Tiv, is a segmentary lineage society that's like down here in Nigeria. You have these societies in South Sudan, non-segmentary lineage. That's it'll come back to me. So famously, with the divine king, the Shilluk people who have this very famous political system with a divine king. And then you can see there's a lot of there's a wide distribution of these different types of societies. So the simple, okay, fine. So that's the first thing we did. So now we want to know what's the impact on conflict. How do we know about conflict? Well, we used a data set which is on the web from ACLED. I was mentioning this when we were talking on Monday to the gentleman from Benin who was interested in looking at the development impact of conflict. ACLED has this amazing geocoded information on conflict all over Africa. So this is just, superimposing, each dot is like a conflict incidence in the ACLED data set, superimposed on these regions, okay? So again here you can see I'm using this Murdoch map. Remember the Murdoch map that Nunn and Wanchikon used? So this is the Murdoch map. We use the Murdoch map, to kind of superimpose the territories of these different groups on top of each other. Okay. Now, one response you might have to this as well, isn't that some historic thing? Like, how do I know that matters today at all? So I think that's an open question. Like, I don't know the answer to that. The one thing we do in the paper, is we try to validate these boundaries. So I'm going to use these boundaries intensively in a minute. So we want to take the boundaries of the map seriously, okay? So how do I know the boundaries of the map really, mean anything today? So if I look at, I don't know, like the Dennis, he's from over here, the Aya people, on the west of Lake Victoria, so here's we managed to code them, and there, I guess that's definitely not a segmentary lineage society because they actually had a famous sort of political system, didn't they? Like a centralized political system. So I'm going to come to that in a second also. So, how do we know that we're going to look at the boundaries, and in particular we're going to look at the boundaries between segmentary lineage societies and non-segmentary lineage societies. But how do I know that tells you anything about people there today? Okay? So there's some way we can validate that. I'm gonna, it's later in the talk, so let me not jump to it. But one thing we did was we took geocoded data from the Afrobarometer where people self-report their ethnicity. And then we asked does that jump at the boundary? You know, so let's say I walk from, Maasai land or something, and I walk towards, the Luo people, and then I cross some boundary on the Murdoch map. I'm not sure who's in between the Kissi, is it? Like, who's between? Yeah, but I go across some boundary from Maasai land to whoever it is, Kissi people or whatever. As everyone moves around, everyone's in Nairobi, and does that predict anything? And the answer is yes, it predicts a lot. I'll show you that later. That's a kind of interesting exercise, just to kind of validate the boundaries. So what you see is if you merge these boundaries with data from the Afrobarometer, you actually see big jumps in people's identities at the boundaries. Okay, so that's interesting. That doesn't tell you anything about how strong these kind of lineage institutions are or whatever. I think that I can't say anything about that. The Afrobarometer doesn't ask questions about things like that. I think that's an empirical issue. I guess most parts of Africa where I've worked personally in detail, I've always been impressed at the kind of the strengths of people's cultures and people's social structures and the persistence of that. It's true in Sierra Leone, it's true in Nigeria, it's certainly true in the DRC. So, but that's just anecdotes. That's not real evidence. That's something that needs to be discussed. So in some sense, what I'm saying is that a lot of these ethnographic sources, summarize what African society looked like, in the 1930s or the 1940s or the 1950s. But how much does African society really look like that today? That's an empirical question. That's an open question. It needs measurement and okay. But so I don't have anything deep to say on that. We're just kind of assuming here that there's some persistence, meaning we're going to compare this social organization of these African societies coded from ethnographic materials which are 50, 60 years old, 70 years old, and we're going to compare contemporary conflict outcomes. And I guess the usual justification for doing that would be, well, if the coding of these African societies is just totally wrong, then you're not going to find anything. It'll just be noise and you won't find anything. But what you see, let me not talk about how representative is our, so you can see from that map that there's a lot of societies missing here. Okay, so one question you could ask is, how representative is the sample of societies that we could code compared to all the societies in the Ethnographic Atlas? So we know a lot of information about these other societies. It's just that we weren't able to classify whether they were segmentary lineage or not. So you could think of it as like a balance. This is yet another balance table, meaning we just look at the here's the groups we could code, here's the groups we couldn't code. We just look at lots of different variables from the Ethnographic Atlas and we see whether they're statistically different. So for example, what does this tell you? Well, this is levels of jurisdictional hierarchy. This is a variable in the Ethnographic Atlas which captures kind of how state-like were you? Like how state-like were these African people? So the more layers of jurisdictional hierarchy, the more a particular people, society had kind of state-like features. Okay, so then some hunter-gatherer society like the Hadza in Tanzania would be like the lowest level, and then then you'd have like the Kikuyu or whatever. Then you'd have something more centralized, and then you could go right up to Bunyoro or Buganda or Rwanda, like a much more state-like society. So you see that places in our sample tend to be more politically centralized. They also tend to have larger population. Why is that? I think that's just because anthropologists study places which have states and which are bigger more than other places. So I think that's really coming from a bias in terms of like the reporting of the information. But mostly, you see that there's not large differences in the covariates, okay, between these two societies. All right, I'm just going to jump that. Okay, so then there's more discussion of this ACLED data set in the paper. It's a very rich data set and it's a cheat. You can download it for free, so it satisfies the Alex test of cheap research. And the rest of the coding, the segmentary lineage society, that was cheap too. I mean, of course, if you're an economist, you understand the notion of opportunity cost. So my time has opportunity costs. I could be consulting for the World Bank, you know, instead of going to the library and reading ethnographic books, but going and reading ethnographic books is much more fun generally than consulting for the World Bank. So there's a, you know, there's a marginal rate of substitution there. So you know, and you know, this is ACLID. There's another data set, Uppsala, also at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And we looked at, so let me, you know, here's a paper, and here's the descriptive statistics, you know. So you know, when I teach, you know, in Chicago, I always say, like, some papers, you know, the descriptive statistics are kind of more interesting than the regressions. And this may be, I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow, you know, because in some sense, like, social science is about, it's about correlation, you know, it's about variation, you know, covariation. And then you have to bring all this complicated machinery to show that that correlation actually represents a causal relationship, you know. And that's kind of what happens in this paper. You know, what happens in this paper is, this is the most interesting table, and then we have to bring all this machinery. But the interesting table is just looking at the averages, okay? So there's data on different sorts of conflict from the ACLID data set, averaged for the 74 societies. So Ambrose is going to be upset. It's like, oh no, it's another of those small data papers. We don't like those small data papers here at the, but, you know, but we had to code this ourselves, man. You know, it took time. So here's the average for segmentary lineage, and here's the average for societies that we could convincingly classify as non-segmentary lineage, okay? And what you see is, it doesn't matter what measure of conflict you take from ACLID, intensity, duration, fatalities, blah, 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 they code different sorts of conflict, like conflict against the state or kind of within society conflict. Whatever way you look at it, conflict is much higher in these segmentary lineage societies, the places we coded as segmentary lineage societies, than non-segmentary lineage societies. I'm going to go back to this table because I can't resist it, which is, you might think, so if you read the paper I wrote for the AERC about taxation, you can see that I talk a lot about the nature of traditional social contracts, political social contracts in Africa. And, you know, I mentioned the extent to which that uses taxation, and I talk about the way that states were organized. Remember, I was talking about Rwanda last week, and about, you know, the cows, okay? So the Rwanda is a sort of, if you read about the history of the state in Rwanda, there's a number of books by historians about the construction of the state, especially in the 19th century. And there's an amazing book by David Newbury, a historian, which is called Kings and Clans, about the historic state on Ijwi Island in Lake Kivu. So let me repeat that. Kings and clans, okay? So in Western social science, state institutions were supposed to replace kinship institutions, right? So the most famous book about the creation of the kind of modern British state looks at the 1530s in the so-called Tudor revolution of government. And what happened in the 1530s? Henry VIII was the king, and the state was basically run by his family, you know. So the exchequer, which dealt with the money, it was all his relatives. And what happened in the 1530s was his relatives were kind of sidelined, and a professional administration appeared, okay? So you know, this is the great transition that Max Weber wrote about, this sort of transition from a patrimonial organization of the state towards a rational legal state. So in Western social science, it's kings or clans, okay? But according to Newbury and Vansina, who also wrote a book about Rwanda, it's kings and clans, meaning when you look at the way many states were organized in Africa, they fused kinship systems with state-like institutions. Like, absolutely fascinating. It's like the opposite of what you're supposed to do when you're creating state institutions. And you can actually kind of see that in our data, you know. So when I talk about the Nuer kind of famously had no state, you know, like the Tiv in Nigeria. So what we did is we took our classification, this is not in the paper, but I like this because I suddenly realized this relates to the paper I wrote for the AERC, which is, if you take this classification between segmentary lineage and non-segmentary lineage societies, and you kind of cross it with looking at how politically centralized they were from this ethnographic atlas. So remember those levels of jurisdictional hierarchy I mentioned, so we can classify them into two bins, 0 or 1. So here's the Nuer, here's the Tiv. So they're uncentralized politically. 2 to 4, which are the more centralized politically. Here's the Aerc. Dennis, you see? I knew you were coming. How about that? So the Kuba Kingdom, I talked about the Kuba Kingdom, right? So here's more politically centralized, but so what's interesting about this picture here, you can see, and here's the Maasai spelt incorrectly. I apologize. It's spelt in the old way, right? There's 2 A's now. So I never realized this thing was made up before I knew I'd be teaching Aya and Maasai people, so I'm excited. What you see here is actually, the data is distributed amongst all 4 cells, meaning there's actually centralized places, like the Douala in Cameroon, which they're classified as segmentary lineage societies, but actually they have states. They're more centralized politically. How could that be? Well, they somehow merge the states with these lineage societies. So the state, like in Rwanda, mirrors the segmentary lineage society. If you read Newbury's book, you see how, when they consolidated the state in Rwanda in the 19th century, the Mwami, the king, kind of appointed governors who then basically incorporated these local chiefs into the state. So it was a kind of fusion of a state with the lineage systems. Okay, so you have everything here. So you have, the Maasai count as non-segmentary lineage. Did we miscode that? and when the sample size is small, you can't risk too much miscoding, right? So anyway, so this is a fun opportunity to talk about stuff you all know much better than I do. Okay, so let me, I told you this is the, all right, we need to have tea soon. Okay, so here's so I can run ordinary least square regressions, but I'm not going to do that, because that just shows you what, okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Okay, so how do we tell a more causal story about this? We exploit the boundaries, okay? So I showed you the boundaries. This is Western Uganda, and here's a border between a segmentary lineage society and a non-segmentary lineage society, and all the black dots are conflict incidents. So now what we're going to assume is that, in some sense, we're going to look at the boundary where you jump from being a segmentary lineage society to a non-segmentary lineage society in a regression discontinuity setup, and we're going to ask, so this model is identical to the model that Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero ran, right? So on the left-hand side, we're going to have one of these conflict variables, and now, contrary to what Ambrose was thinking, we go from small data to big data. How do we go to big data? Grid cells, okay? So we're going to do this at the grid cell level. We have these, we can geocode these conflict intervals. So you can see we can do this at the grid cell level. So we go from, it's like feast or famine, right? So we go from famine to feast in terms of data. So now we can look at, I is going to index grid cell, and we can use all sorts of fancy fixed effects here as well. But like the main message here is that, again, we have this dummy variable which is just switched on. When you go to this segmentary lineage society, we have this geographical running variable, which is just, a linear polynomial distance to the border. It's exactly the same as the Lowe's and Montero paper. And we have different sorts of covariates. We can do some stuff, at least geographical stuff at the grid cell level, not very interesting. And then, so here's the picture. You can see here's 0. then this is when you hit a segmentary lineage society. You can see as you go from a non-segmentary lineage to a segmentary lineage society, there's a significant jump at the border in the extent of conflict. Okay, so now we just basically, what we do is we just pool all the parts of the map where segmentary lineage societies and non-segmentary lineage societies like sit next to each other, and we run the regression, blah, 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 except there's different models of conflict. So let me finish with this and we can have tea. Here's that one thing, which is when you see we spend a lot of time trying to, we need to take the boundaries of the map seriously. So how can I convince you that those boundaries make sense? Well, this is what we did with the self-reported ethnicity from the Afrobarometer. So this is pooling, basically, this is pooling everything we could do from the Afrobarometer, and think of this as just being, this is like the generic border, like when I go from, and these are the average effects of when I go from one society to another, so when I cross the border, when I'm outside Maasai land, there's very few Maasai people, but when I cross into Maasai land, suddenly there's large numbers of Maasai. That's just one specific example. This is the average. What this is showing on average is that these borders actually do make sense, that the borders are pretty predictive of, these identities in some sense, that even today, the identities within Africa seem to a kind of pretty large extent, much larger actually than I would have expected. When we came up with this idea, I wasn't very convinced it was going to work. But the border seems to be pretty predictive of where people who identify in a particular way live. Of course, there's Maasai people in, Nairobi or whatever it is, or in New York City or Paris or whatever. But there's a significant jump in these identities at the border. So I think this is a kind of way of defending the research design as sensible. Of course, what this tells you nothing about is whether this kind of notion of a lineage society actually tells you much about people's behavior, or people's, ideology today. Okay, I'm not sure I want to show you the regressions. These pictures are nice, aren't they? Yeah, and then there's lots of regressions, blah, blah, blah. And, okay, so that's all I want to say about that. And now for something completely different, as they say in Monty Python. There's lots of, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, but there's a style to a paper, and I'm going to talk about, and we have to do all sorts of really silly things. As referees get you to do really silly things. Okay, African system of property rights. But this paper is not really about Africa, right? The Pashtun in the south of Afghanistan are a segmentary lineage society. So Frederick Barth, who was a Norwegian social anthropologist, wrote a famous book about the Pashtuns. In the Arabian Peninsula, you have segmentary lineage societies, in the Bedouin, for example, or the Berbers in North Africa. So again, this is, Marshall Salin's original argument was motivated by talking about the Dinka and the Nuer. But you could sort of say, well, gosh, this is pretty interesting. We talk about it in the conclusion. Does this tell me anything about Afghanistan or whatever? So you have these segmentary lineage societies everywhere in the world. So you could say this is an example of, using African materials to talk about a broader social science question. Like in the same way that Weigel's paper was. Why do this in Africa? Well, two reasons. One, I don't know that much about Africa, but I know more about Africa than I do about Afghanistan or Asia, And the second reason is we have the map. So the map suggested to us a kind of identification strategy using this regression discontinuity technique. Okay, it's a very powerful technique. It's very simple to operationalize. You just end up running a simple, it's like the Kuba Kingdom paper, right? You just end up running an OLS regression. But it's the sort of, what's the right word? It's the, the narrative. You have to sell people on the plausibility and the interest of the thing. It's the rhetoric. That's the word I was looking for. So the rhetoric of research. And then we spend a lot of time, you know, on the rhetoric, and we spend a lot of time on robustness and checking, you know, and that's important, and you'll see, I'll talk about that tomorrow also. Okay, so let's have tea, and then if you have a question, you could ask me over tea, and then I'll come back and I'll talk about Goldstein and Udrich. Professor Bautista made up the slides, and she was going to talk about it, but unfortunately she couldn't be here today. So, okay, great, thank you, great. I need caffeine. It's a bit depressing, this paper. It's a bit depressing paper, but I wanted to talk about the core technique and the materials we use. It's a cheap paper. See, that's why I wanted to teach it. It's a cheap paper. Go to the library, take a bunch of books out, code the data, download the other stuff from the web. Somebody sends you the shape files of the ethnographic and Murdoch Ethnographic Map.
Yeah, I always refer to the methodology being expensive because of that experience we had with in the study we were trying to do. Imagine investing from 2016, and then the principal investigators will travel all the way to come and monitor the program. Then after COVID, we could not continue. Yeah. So they had put in a lot of resources, and they had hired a local research assistant and a research manager. So they put in a lot of resources in that program. And, but it did not even pick up because we had not gone beyond the pilot stage.
Yeah, but that's research. You know, research often.
Yeah, that's why I'm
only talking about research projects that are successful. If you want me to start talking about research projects for us, I could do that too. You know, it's like you look at these papers and you think like, oh my gosh, that guy, you know, everything he touches turns to gold, but that's not true at all. So it's not true. Stuff fails. That's research. But as they say, what doesn't kill you? The Goldstein and Udrich paper is it tries to understand how some of those rights work in Ghana and what their consequences are for productivity. One of the stylized facts about African economic history is that prior to the colonial period, there was a complete absence of factor markets in Africa. There wasn't a labor market, there wasn't a land market, there weren't capital markets. And, what substituted for a labor market? Well, your social networks we were talking about yesterday. How is it today, even, my friend, when you want to farm in rural Sierra Leone, when you want to get someone to clear your land, or start planting, how do you do that? There's no real labor market. You trigger your kinship network, basically. That's how you get labor to work on the farm. So I think that's of course now there's a labor market and there's a capital market, but the land market has developed much less in rural Africa. I don't know anything about Kenya, but at least the parts where I've worked, there's much less of a land market than other types of factor markets. Okay, so and if you're an economist, you think that markets are the solution to everything, right? So then the fact that there's no land market should be a problem. So this paper by Marcus Goldstein and Chris Udrich collects data, in Aquapim, which is kind of inland from Accra, not very far inland, 20, 30 miles inland from Accra. It's a beautiful ridge, the Aquapim Ridge. People all grow the same stuff. So they grow a bit of pineapples, for market, but mostly they grow maize and cassava, and nobody uses fertilizer. Okay, so if you grow maize and cassava and you don't use fertilizer, fallowing is very important in order to allow the land to kind of recover. And there's a discussion of, what's the optimal amount of time to fallow a plot before you start planting it again. It's maybe 6 or 7 years. Okay, men and women farm different plots. I think Professor Bautista is going to talk about this tomorrow in eastern Nigeria. In eastern Nigeria, it's not just men and women farm different plots. Men and women farm different crops. Women grow cocoa yams. Men grow yams. Men are not allowed to grow cocoa yams. Women are not allowed to grow yams. So that's even more distinct. But here they farm different plots. I don't know if we have a map of the plots here. And the kind of, here's the puzzle in some sense, which is, so you can calculate,
that the optimal amount of following is like 6 years or 7 years. But there's a huge amount of variation in the amount of following, and it's enormously correlated with productivity and profits. So why is that? That you could sort of say, that's the puzzle here. So it's a great puzzle. Okay, it's a really great village. Okay, so you know, this is, you know, also you see that this is an expensive paper. Chris and Marcus. Chris went on sabbatical to the University of Ghana for a year, and he collected the data with Marcus, who was a PhD student of his at Yale at the time. But, you know, they surveyed, they collect, you see very detailed information, particularly plot by plot data on soil type and pH, like very detailed information about kind of fundamentals of agricultural productivity and soil quality, multiple interviews on people to kind of capture their agricultural practices, following practices, property rights, etc. Okay, and here's the first thing. So I said the puzzle, you could say, is, or the question is, you know, when we know what's the optimal amount to follow, why is there so much variation, including suboptimal variation, meaning people follow too little and then they start planting again and the land is just not productive and they can't make so much money. Okay, so the first thing they do is to sort of look at that puzzle a bit more systematically, is run the following regression, which is profits on a bunch of very complicated covariates capturing the slope, and whether or not the plot is farmed by a woman. Okay, and they find, what do you find? Women own far less, they make far less profits than men do, controlling for, you know, plot size and soil type and things like that, and household fixed effects here. Okay, so these are sort of, they're using within household variation. So within a household, you have a man, you may have multiple wives, so you're using variation within the household. Okay, so women make less profits than men, and so the way the thing kind of transpires is to say, okay, so there's some correlation here between gender and these different following and productivity outcomes, but what is it that's really driving that? And it turns out, you know, here's the story is, I look at this table. So when you start reading the paper, I saw Chris present this paper years ago, so I always sort of present it, not like the way it's written in the published version, but actually the way he presented it, which I found so interesting. And he presented it as a sort of gender, this is a gender paper, you know, and it is, but not for the obvious reason. And this is the table that kind of tells you everything, which is, this is, you know, different rights to plots of land of non-office holders and office holders. So think of, you know, people who hold traditional office within the local political institution. So chief, you know, chieftaincy, speaker, some kind of lineage, elder. So local political, traditional political elites or office holders. Okay, so and, you know, and this is just basically looking at the percent of cultivated plots that respondents claim the right to rent out. So office holders are far more likely to have the right to rent out some plot they control. They're far more likely, they're twice as likely to be able to say they can lend it to somebody else. They're twice as likely to say they can actually sell the land, okay? And they're much, much more likely to be able to say they can determine who inherits the land. And if you look at their following, meaning percentage of plots followed for more than 6 years, so that's like the optimal, you see that a higher proportion of their plots are being followed for a longer time. So you see in this table of descriptive statistics that there's a big difference between people who hold political office in their rights and in their following activities. And so as the story unfolds, you find that the real problem for women is that women basically hold far fewer local political offices. That it's people with traditional political rights who have more control over access to land they're more confident that they can maintain their property rights on plots, and so they're willing to fallow for longer. Women are more insecure, so what do? They don't fallow, they keep farming, because that's a way of establishing your kind of de facto property rights. But if you leave the plot fallow, you risk it being reallocated by some chief to somebody else. Okay, so that's the story in a nutshell. I'm trying to see what else I want to talk about. Okay, so this is just the sort of descriptive statistics here. You know, this is, you know, looking at office holders and non-office holders, and you know, gender 1 equals female. So there are some women office holders, and I'm going to talk. I'll talk about queen mothers in a little bit, you know, because I think actually there's a whole layer of this that they never got into, which I find very interesting. And then they collected very detailed information on, you know, on here. But if I look at fallow duration, you can see office holders. The mean fallow duration of office holders is 4.8. The mean of non-office holders is 3.9. So office holders fallow on average 1 more year than non-office holders. Okay, so that's going to be the main story. You can see also length of tenure. Their length of tenure is over double the length of tenure of non-office holders. Okay, so and then, you know, a lot of this is meant to show you that these plots are kind of balanced on other characteristics. It's not that you might think, well, isn't the obvious story here that the office holders get the best land, you know, and the women get the crappy land? So in the paper, they spend a lot of time trying to convince you that that's not the right story. And you know, the obvious way to do that is to just look at balance on observables and say, I don't know, you know, I think that's why there's so much effort in the paper goes into actually trying to measure these characteristics of these plots that make them more or less productive. But that's not the story they want to tell. The story they want to tell is about this property rights story. Okay, so this turns into a sort of classical kind of instrumental variable model. You know, you could say the real thing they're interested in estimating is the relationship between profits and fallowing. You know, there could be, you know, and that's individual I, household H, you know, plot P or whatever. I think I got that right. Did I do that right? Anyway, but this fallowing is really endogenous, right? So fallowing depends maybe on gender, depends on politics, it depends on all sorts of things. So this is the second stage. So they're interested in modeling, you know, the variation in fallow with an instrument, you know, and what's the instrument? Well, office holding. Okay, so the idea is that, you know, whether or not, remember, fallowing is plot specific as well. So it's like, you know, individuals have multiple plots, and the fallowing duration can differ on different plots. Why? Because property rights are just so complicated. You know, so you know, the property rights don't necessarily attach to you. That may have some general effect, but there may be differences on different plots because you got different plots in different ways. So you have different rights to different plots. Okay, so this is like very, okay, so that's at the individual, the household, at the plot level, and then, you know, this is just whether or not you hold a traditional political office. And here, you know, we haven't talked that much about this, but if, you know, so this is just like the Nunn and Wanchicon paper, right, where they were trying to look at the impact of the historic incidence of slavery on trust in Africa today, and that was the second stage. And the first stage, they modeled the variation in historical slavery by distance from the coast, you know, hypothesizing that other things equal, the further the further an ethnic group was from the coast, the less likely it was going to be impacted by the slave trade. Okay, so here, the exclusion restriction is that the only channel via which office holding impacts profits is through the fallowing decision. Yeah, so that's a little bit difficult to buy. But that's why they control for all of these aspects of land. You know, so the obvious problem with that is if you're an office holder, you're going to get the best land, and then you're going to make more profits irrespective of the fallowing decision. Okay, but that's why they spend so much time trying to control for all these observable characteristics of the plot. Okay, and here's what happens when you run that regression, run that two-stage least squares. Here's the first stage. So here's fallow duration. you're modeling fallow duration as a function of these, here's the main action. One, if the person holds a traditional office, okay? And then in the second stage, you're running that model of profits on fallow duration, okay? So you can see, and you're instrumenting fallow duration. There's multiple instruments here. They put other stuff in here as well. It's a bit of a soup, but the main story is office holding, as I showed you, okay? And so here's the interesting result, right? So you find that fallow duration has a big significant effect on profits, but once I control for fallow duration instrumented by these kind of political variables, I find that the gender effect goes away, okay? So this is not statistically significant anymore. So it is a story about women and gender, but it's not some kind of direct discrimination. The problem is that women are not sufficiently represented in the traditional political institutions, and that means they don't have secure property rights on their plots. They fallow less because that's a way of maintaining your de facto property rights. But once you control for that fallowing, and you control for the endogeneity in the fallowing decision through this first stage, the direct effect of gender kind of goes away. So I think that's the very interesting story. That's the very interesting story that they develop. I'm not sure what I want to say. Yeah, there's nerdy comments. I could make nerdy comments about the econometrics. They have there's a weak first stage. Who knows about the weak instrument problem? Anyway, let me not bore you with nerdy econometrics. That's for the future. That's for your next incarnation, okay? So I think, we haven't been stressing nerdy econometrics too much. Nerdy econometrics has its time and its place, like everything else in life. But that's down the road, unless you have a good question, then nerdy econometrics isn't going to help you ask a good question, So, and nerdy econometrics without a good question doesn't get you anywhere, in my opinion. So, all right. So, unless you're an econometrician. But if you want to be a theoretical econometrician, then go for it. Yeah. Okay. So let me say a few things about, so I could talk about, but what I find funny about this story is the idea that I don't know that much about Akan society. I know a little bit because I had a Ghanaian PhD student, and they have powerful women in Akan society. Okay, they have queen mothers. Queen mothers have stools. Okay, who decides? So in the Akan society, you have these chiefs. Who decides who becomes chief in Akan society? Well, here's a very famous description from Kofi Busia. So Kofi Busia was one of the first wave of Ghanaian intellectuals who came to Britain. He did a PhD in sociology. His dissertation was published in 1951. It's an absolutely fantastic book, The Position of the Chief in the Modern Political System of Ashanti. So quite a lot of it is about colonial rule and the impact of colonial political institutions on Ashanti political institutions. But the start of the book is a description of the pre-colonial political institutions. Kofi Busia, of course, went on to become a political opponent of President Nkrumah. He was the president of. I'm trying to remember when they switched from a prime ministerial to a presidential political system, but I don't remember if he was the prime minister or the president from 1969 until he was overthrown by the military and he went into exile. But he was a brilliant intellectual. He wrote a lot of really fantastic stuff about African politics also. But this is just a description of the crowning of a chief. A chief dies, and this is like north of Kumasi, in the place where he wrote his. He was a sociologist, so the book is it's like an ethnography of political institutions in this town, Wenchi. I think it's northwest of Kumasi. But the chief died, a new one had to be appointed. The elders had to approach the Queen Mother and ask her to nominate a candidate for the stool. So the stool is like, that's what they call the chief, the stool. The stool is the chief. Then they had a large meeting of all the people, the commoners would be asked what they thought about it. So the Queen Mother nominates a candidate. The senior elder would announce. Thus the Queen Mother said, "What do the people say?" If the candidate was not accepted, the Queen Mother was informed and the royals proceeded to make another nomination. At the end of the day, this is what Busia says, it was for the Queen Mother to say whether or not the popular candidate had a kin right to the stool. So the Queen Mother was the sort of repository of knowledge about the history of the stool, which is like a particular chieftaincy, and had the right to kind of nominate candidates for the stool. So Queen Mothers had their own they had their own stools, they had their own courts, they solved judicial problems between women. So one thing I find puzzling, so I think this is probably not for anybody in this room, but if there were Ghanaians here, I'd be saying, or online, like something that seems very under-conceptualized in the paper is the political power of women, because everything I know about Akan society suggests there's extremely powerful women are. And there's a sort of parallel system of political office holding, like with these Queen Mothers. How do they, what's the impact of them on these property rights? I don't know. So if I had time and I knew enough about Ghana, I'd investigate this. Professor Bautista is going to talk about powerful women in eastern Nigeria tomorrow. But, and you know, they collected information about, when they surveyed people, they collected information about all sorts of things, you know, if your mother was a trader, if your mother was a farmer. But I wonder if, you know, some things are beyond the imaginary of Western scholars. You know, like you can't, in fact, if you read Busia's book, it's like extremely interesting. And even more interesting is Robert Rattray. So Robert Rattray was the first kind of colonial anthropologist who studied the Ashanti people. And there's a beautiful, so he wrote this book, he wrote many books about the Ashanti legal system and about Ashanti culture and religion. But in his main book about the Ashanti constitution, there's a wonderful bit talking about powerful women and women's involvement in politics. And Rattray sort of says, you know, he had no idea there were these queen mothers and that women exercised all this power. And nobody ever mentioned it to him. And then one day he heard these Ghanaians talking about this. And he said, what are you talking about? So then he went back and said, like, why didn't you tell me about this? And the Ghanaian said, well, we didn't think you'd understand it. So it's a sort of fantastic example of, like, if you come from Western society, it's kind of unimaginable that such an institution exists. So you don't ask the right questions, you know. So based on just my very superficial knowledge of Akan society, I wonder if they asked the right questions about women's power in this context, you know, because, you know, you go into the market, Professor Bautista talked about this on the first day, you know, you go into the market in Kumasi, everything is run by women, you know, women run the trade, women run the mercantile economy, the women are massively empowered in many ways, economically and indeed politically. So I like the paper, it's a great paper, but sometimes it worries me. Okay. So that's all I had to say today. I don't know if people have questions. The idea of today was, again, canonical research results. Canonical research results. And I'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow. And you know, that's what you should take away from it. And you should take away, like, this discussion of African society. Big intellectual questions. Or you can talk about specific questions about Africa. And I guess collecting data I like collecting data. I didn't start out like that. You know, I started out as a mathematical economist. You know, my thesis advisor was a general equilibrium theorist, and I just thought general equilibrium theory was the coolest thing on the planet. And then I left, you know, Yale, and then I realized, wow, this doesn't explain anything. So it's great. It's a framework, you know, it's a framework. It's a logical framework, and you can apply it, but you need to inject empirical information into the framework to get an answer about something you care about. So I guess, you know, that's the rest of my career, but I could talk about that a little bit tomorrow. Yeah, but I think, you know, anyway, I'm talking too much. Get to present on Monday. I think we should give them a chance to present, and then I'll talk about colonial origins. Professor Bautista will talk, and something that came up discussing at lunchtime also is, you know, for all the people in the room here, I need to talk to Abebe and Professor Bautista just about what next. You know, Moses was asking, like, what next? What next? Like, how do we? And I think what next is, you know, we should organize something virtually. I don't think we're not going to be in Nairobi anytime soon, I don't think, Professor Bautista and I. But we can organize something on Zoom. We can organize something collectively, and let's think about that, and let's think about what would be useful for you, and, you know, what would be interesting for you. But I have to talk to Abebe about that, and Professor Bautista. So, okay, cool.